Hi. In an earlier video on growth accounting, I talked about the long-run determinants of output per person, which is one of the key measures of economic welfare in any society. Today, I want to dig down a little bit into one of the elements of output per person that is the matter of most economic interest. So if you recall, when we looked at growth accounting, we looked at output per person as being a function of output per worker multiplied by the number of workers divided by the number of working age people in the economy, or the participation rate, and then the number of working age people on the total population. And in that earlier video we talked about these as being three important elements of the growth in output per worker over the longer run. And these can be thought of in terms of the three Ps: productivity, participation, and the dependency ratio, or population structures. Today I want to look at this element in particular, what's called labour productivity in many contexts, or output per worker. Now, without getting too technical, I just want to start with the notion of Y as being a function of the capital stock of an economy and the labour supply of an economy. Because this is the way that most macroeconomists think about output per worker. In general, most macroeconomists say that the key determinants of output are these three elements: A, or technology, or the way that we mix all of the different inputs to the production function; the capital stock; and the labour supply. Now, there are other things that you could add to that. For example, the resources that we use as inputs, land, and you could also add Q, which is the quality of the labour supply. So how many years of education, for example, or how much experience. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we can leave this as a fairly simple production function. Now again, without getting too technical, but to give you an example of the workhorse model that macroeconomists use, there's a particular function called the Cobb-Douglas production function, which macroeconomists use because it seems to fit the long-term observed empirical patterns of production and macroeconomic patterns across the economy. Using the Cobb-Douglas production function, we see Y as a function of A multiplied by K to some kind of exponent, and the labour supply to 1 minus that exponent. Now, this has a number of characteristics. The critical one for our purposes is that it has constant returns to scale. And what that means is, if we double all the inputs, then we also double output. Now, not all macroeconomists would agree that this is the way the broad macroeconomy behaves over the long run, but most think that that's a sensible starting point. Now, the reason I say that that's the working horse model for macroeconomists is that when we do some fairly basic high school mathematical manipulations to this production function, which I won't go through now, and when we do make an assumption of constant returns to scale, then we can end up with the growth in Y on L, or the growth in output per worker falling out of this equation, has a relationship to just two things: the growth rate in A and the growth rate in the amount of capital per worker. So we really only need to look at these two things if we want to understand how output per worker grows over the longer run. And what are these two things? Well, the growth rate in A is generally called multi-factor productivity. This is some kind of measure of the effectiveness with which, or the efficiency with which, we use all of the different inputs in the production function to come out with outputs at the other end. And this measure of capital per worker is often referred to as capital deepening. Now, most analysis by public policy agencies around the world of long-term growth in output per worker will decompose that into multi-factor productivity growth and capital deepening growth. So if you look at this graph on the screen right now, we can see from the 2017 productivity report by the Productivity Commission an analysis of productivity growth over the last 30 odd years in Australia, decomposing growth per worker over that period of time into multi-factor productivity growth and capital deepening. As you can see, capital deepening tends to grow at about 1% per year, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. In contrast, multi-factor productivity growth varies much more. It can be well over 1% or close to zero, or in fact, it can be negative on occasions. But based on these assumptions, we can decompose output per worker growth into these two elements. Now, you can come up with more complicated functions for output. You could include a little Q here for quality of labour, and this second graph that we look at here is from the Bureau of Labour Statistics in the United States, and it decomposes growth in output per worker over the last 30 years into multi-factor productivity growth and capital deepening and the labour contribution. And if you look at this decomposition by the BLS in the United States, you'll see that generally the contribution from the labour quality is positive but low, and the rest is split roughly half and half between multi-factor productivity growth and capital deepening, a slightly different pattern to what we observe in Australia. So I want to make some observations about these two core elements of the growth in output per worker. The first one is a fairly technical point, but I think it's worth making, because whenever we look at publications from public policy agencies, we need to bear this in mind. We can generally observe capital deepening because we can roughly measure the capital stock and we can roughly measure labour. We generally can't observe this, and this is what we call the residual of our studies. So that doesn't mean that this is not of interest, but it simply indicates that we've always got to be a bit cautious when we look at multi-factor productivity growth numbers, because we can't observe it and it is backed out of whatever calculations we do. And so it would be highly dependent, therefore, on the functional form we choose and on what factors we include. Secondly, I think it's worth mentioning some uncertainty in this field. There is a degree of uncertainty in relation to multi-factor productivity growth numbers. They vary considerably, as we can see from the Productivity Commission graph. Robert Solow, who was one of the greatest macroeconomists of the 20th century, once said that we see the computer age everywhere, except in the productivity numbers. And this is what we see to some degree in the Productivity Commission numbers. Multi-factor productivity growth has been very low or close to zero the last 10 years. And this has been an era when internet connectivity, when the growth of cloud computing and all sorts of other technology have exploded. Somewhat surprisingly, we haven't seen this in our productivity growth numbers, and nobody's 100% clear as to why that's the case. Another factor when it comes to multi-factor productivity growth is that it is business cycle dependent. What that means is that the utilisation of capital, for example, our utilities, can have a significant effect on multi-factor productivity growth numbers, and we always have to bear that in mind. The next point I want to make in relation to these two is in relation to the variability of them. So capital deepening tends to be relatively low variation. It tends to be, in Australia, around 1% per year, give or take. Whereas, as we can see in that productivity growth graph from the Productivity Commission, multi-factor productivity growth can be close to zero or negative or very high. This is something that is important for us to think about, particularly to the extent that government activity can affect MFP growth. There's also a big debate as to which of these is the more important driver of output per person, output per worker over the long run. Many economists believe that multi-factor productivity growth is the key driver. There's still a debate around that. And if we look at the BLS numbers from the US, each of these seems to contribute about the same, but this is a very important and open debate that we're still seeing play out. And finally, if we look at some policy implications, if we look at multi-factor productivity growth in Australia, it does appear that the microeconomic reform of the early 80s and mid-80s had a significant impact on multi-factor productivity growth in the years following that. If one looks at the very high multi-factor productivity growth of the late 90s, there's a strong argument to believe that the reforms of the Hawke-Keating government were then manifesting themselves in the economy. In contrast, it's important to note that capital deepening does require some foregone consumption. And this is an important policy consideration. More capital per worker requires either people in Australia or people overseas saving more now so that that capital can be deployed in the production function. That means less consumption today. So there is a trade-off for a significant increase in the capital to labour ratio. To give an example, Hong Kong and Singapore both saw their economies more than double between 1970 and 1990. Alwyn Young did a very interesting study of these two economies. He found that Singapore, through encouraged and to some degree forced savings, saw a dramatic increase in the capital to labour ratio, and much of their growth was through an increase in the deployment of capital. In contrast, in Hong Kong, with a much freer economy, much of their growth was through multi-factor productivity growth. There are many who would argue that if you can achieve more of your growth through multi-factor productivity growth, rather than through capital deepening, you have to forego less income. And so the Singapore versus Hong Kong debate is a really interesting one. And in Singapore, in fact, between 1970 and 1990, we saw negative multi-factor productivity growth, and in Hong Kong, very positive multi-factor productivity growth. So, to conclude this video, what are the next steps? Well, I would say that multi-factor productivity growth remains, for most macroeconomists, the core concern when it comes to growth in output per worker. So what is the next wave of microeconomic reform? The Productivity Commission, in its 2017 update, indicated that they thought that state governments of all three levels of government would likely be at the forefront of the next wave of microeconomic reform. And we should expect that major areas of service delivery, like health and education, would be at the centre of that. But in addition, more efficient use of energy networks and carbon abatement. In terms of capital deepening, I think that one of the big debates coming up is going to be how much of the capital deepening that we experience over the next few decades is going to involve robots and AI. How much of that is going to be labour augmenting, adding to our productivity and wages? How much of it is going to be labour replacement? There's a big debate on, and many of the world's macroeconomists are divided on this point. And in a future video, I'm going to look specifically at the issue of whether robots are labour replacing or labour augmenting, and whether, for example, we should tax robots. So today we looked at growth accounting again. And we decomposed one of the elements of the broader equation that we looked at last time, the one that most macroeconomists tend to focus on. The next challenge for government, I believe, is how to boost multi-factor productivity and how to manage capital deepening.